create Jordan, to create Palestine, to create Lebanon out of Syria. And gone went that extraordinary opportunity. And we like to think of these people as all being divided, as indeed we encourage them to be. Look at all the maps we publish. We have a map of Iraq. You're very familiar with it. Shiites at the bottom, of course. Sunnis in the middle in their famous triangle or octagon or pentagon or whatever it is. And then the Kurds at the top. We do the same in Lebanon. Shiites at the bottom, of course, and on the right-hand side. Then the Sunnis in Sidon, and the Sunnis and Shiites in southern Beirut, and then the Christians in northern Beirut, and then Sunnis and Alawites in the northern city of Tripoli. Well, the British Army used to do this in Northern Ireland. I've got their maps. In Belfast, Catholic areas, of course, were coloured green. Protestant areas were coloured orange, and those people inconsiderate enough to marry across the religious divide, they had a sort of pale brown colour, medium sherry, very English. But the interesting thing I always think is that, while we constantly emphasise to these people how divided they are, we do not practice this on our own cities. What was the last time you saw a black-white ethnic map of Washington? I don't think you'll ever see it published in the Washington Post. What was the last time you saw a map of Toronto by ethnic origin? Mississauga in the west, colour it green for Muslim, probably, or Montreal. I mean, you'd have to probably run the front line down the metro line between Quebecois and English speakers. How about an ethnic map of New York? Multicoloured, but you could do it, but it won't be published in the New York Times, because our society is flawless, perfect, civilizational, united. Their societies are divided, and if they don't remember it, by God, we'll tell them. We'll point it out in our newspapers and our articles. So we don't read history. We have a false narrative of history. We're told this constant refrain, Iran, 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 the mad mullahs with the black turbans, and this crackpot Ahmadinejad, he is a crackpot, by the way, want to have a bomb and destroy Israel, and of course destroy all the Palestinians, and then Iran will be destroyed, etc. The narrative that is laid down by our presidents and our generals and our prime ministers, and I'm afraid our journalists, and by Tom Friedman, is a narrative in which part of the beginning of it is snapped off and thrown away. What is the real story of Iranian nuclear power? It starts with the Shah of Iran, our friend, the policeman in the Gulf, the king of kings. He wanted nuclear facilities in Iran, and the Europeans stood on each other's shoulders to bid for contracts for nuclear facilities. The big nuclear station at Bushehr, such a threat to us now apparently, was built by Siemens, the German company. And when the Shah came to New York on his way for a big bear hug from Carter on the White House lawn, he gave an interview on TV in New York in which he said, I'd like to have the atom bomb for Iran. And when asked why, not in any hostile way, of course, he said, well, the Soviets have got one, the Americans have got one, why shouldn't Iran? And I was present after the Islamic Revolution when Khomeini had returned to Tehran, to Iran, and he spoke in Tehran in a room about 5 times the size of this. And I heard him say, in the same room, he said, nuclear facilities are the work of the devil and we shall close them down. And the Iranians closed them down. Then came the Iran-Iraq War, and by 1984, Saddam, who had invaded, of course, with our encouragement and military assistance, began to soak the Iranian frontline trenches in gas, of which some of the components came from the United States and, of course, from Germany. At which point the Iranian military went to Khomeini and said, he's using weapons, Saddam is using weapons of mass destruction, he'll use nuclear weapons next, we've got to reopen the facilities. And Khomeini reluctantly did so. That is the first part of the story which has been chopped off and thrown away. We have to start the narrative of Iran with the mad mullahs wanting a bomb. So you see, this is one of the problems that you keep having to say. I mean, I can't do interviews with American television because you don't get enough time to explain this. You've got to go with their narrative. Well, will we bomb Iran? Well, will we? I'll tell a sobering story. I believe we will not. That's why I think the senior officers in the Pentagon went to see the commanders of the Israeli army at the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv. It's in Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, in Israel, and tell the Israelis, if you bomb Iran, you're on your own, because it is quite clear to me, and when I speak to US servicemen, senior servicemen, America is overcommitted. It cannot take on a third war, which is interesting because we've got Pakistan coming up, or Iraqistan, as I now call the area between Baghdad and Islamabad. But Seymour Hersh tells us there will be attacks on Iran. Seymour Hersh is an old friend of mine. I admire him enormously. God bless him for American journalists. You don't have many great ones like Seymour Hersh. And Cy Hersh said to me, Robert, he said, you say there's not going to be an attack on Iran. Right. I said there will be. Right. He said, do I remember back in 2002, you told me the Americans weren't going to invade Iraq? And I said, yes, I did. He said, and what did I tell you? I said, you said they would. I said, there you go. I don't think we are going to attack Iran, but whether Israel will, I don't think so, but it's possible. And I'll give you an example of the degree to which this is taken seriously. The Emir of Qatar, and I know this is a fact because I was in Qatar 3 weeks ago talking to his friends, the Emir of Qatar has actually told the Americans that he wants to give them more land on the huge American base in Qatar, the largest base the Americans have in the Middle East, on the other side from Doha, and we'd like some of the land back, which is closest to the capital city. Because, you see, if the Iranians start firing missiles at the Americans, which they will if they're attacked by either the Americans or the Israelis, the Emir of Qatar does not want them falling on Doha. But that is exactly the detail to which people take this seriously out in the Middle East. As I say, I don't think we're going to do that. And I bloody well hope not. Because every morning I wake up in Beirut at my home and I hear the palm trees moving and I hear the wash of the Mediterranean in front of my house and I think, where is the next explosion coming? Explosion political, in many cases, explosion real, physical. And there always is one every day. When I went to the Middle East, we had 3 stories to write a week. Now I'm bombarded by 14 reports a week. And I don't see any hope out there. Not between Palestinians and Israelis, not over Iraq, not over Afghanistan. I mean, what are we talking about? When I listen to Obama and McCain, I must say I'm looking forward much more sadistically to Thursday's debate, but that's a different matter. So are you. So are you, aren't you? Yes, yes. Oh. Can she be better than the actress is the question, isn't it? It'll all be the same quotes anyway. But no, I listen to them. The story seems to be, the news story is, we won in Afghanistan, and we rushed off and won in Iraq, then we lost in Iraq, and now we're going back to win again in Afghanistan, and bomb Pakistan at the same time. This is preposterous. One of the things that always strikes me is not just how we don't read history, but we don't read the people who wrote so well about 1920 at the time. Here is Lawrence of Arabia. He had an article in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1929, and the title was, he filed under the entry for guerrillas and guerrilla warfare. Just listen to Lawrence of Arabia writing in 1929 and think about Iraq today. Right? Writing of Arab resistance to Turkish occupation in the First World War, 1914 to 1918, of course he was leading the resistance, he was leading the Arab insurgents. He asks of the insurgents, suppose they were an influence, a thing invulnerable, intangible, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile as a whole, firm-rooted, nourished through long stems to the head, main supply routes. The Arabs might be a vapor. Lawrence uses, of course, the metaphor of the horror of gas warfare from the First World War. To control the land they occupied, the Turks would have need of a fortified post every 4 square miles, and a post could not be less than 20 men. This is Iraq he's talking about. The Turks would need 600,000 men, we've got 148,000, or you have, to meet the combined ill will of the local Arab people. They had 100,000 men available, 48,000 less than the Americans have today. The fortified posts, of course, prefigure Rumsfeld's lily pads across the desert. Accurately predicting al-Qaeda's modern-day use of the internet, Lawrence wrote that the printing press is the greatest weapon in the armory of the modern commander of guerrillas. For insurgents, battles were a mistake. Napoleon had spoken in angry reaction against the excessive finesse of the 18th century, when most men almost forgot that war did give license to murder. And Lawrence, realizing in his canny way that he was right, continued with these frightening predictions. Rebellion must have an unassailable base in the minds of men converted to its creed. It must have a sophisticated alien enemy in the form of a disciplined army of occupation, too small to fulfill the doctrine of acreage, too few to adjust number to space in order to dominate the area effectively from fortified posts. This is the surge, and what will happen to the surge after we reduce our troops, of course. The insurgency must have a friendly population, not actively friendly, but sympathetic to the point of not betraying rebel movements to the enemy. Rebellions can be made by 2% active in a striking force and 98% passively sympathetic. Granted mobility, security, time and doctrine, victory will rest with the insurgents, for the algebraical factors are in the end decisive, and against them perfections of means and spirit struggle quite in vain. Lawrence is now the bestseller author for US commanders in Baghdad, and I'm not surprised. You know, I do think one of the reasons why we now face such insurgence, such violence, such pain, such anguish among the Muslim community is something we don't acknowledge or think about. That by and large, in the Islamic world, Muslims have not lost their faith. They still believe in God. They actually believe in God. In the West, and I know there are some exceptions, especially in America, and I sometimes see Christians sneaking in and out of churches in England from time to time on Sundays. In the West, by and large, we've lost our faith. That's why our books always say Muslims and the West, not Muslims and Christians, or Islam and the West, not Islam and Christendom. We acknowledge silently this difference without thinking about it or actually saying, hang on a minute, is there a problem there? And I think that the frustration and anguish of Muslims at being dominated constantly, militarily, politically, socially, culturally, by a people who have largely lost the faith when they have not, is one of the reasons that we don't understand Muslims and they don't understand us. I'm talking in a political sense, not in a human sense when I say that. You know, one of the... I remember the quotation from Tariq Aziz just before the 1991 Gulf War when he was having his last-ditch so-called talks with James Baker when he was Secretary of State for George Bush Sr. in Geneva. And he stood next to James Baker and said, 18 million Iraqis cannot be defeated by a computer. But they were. I'm not sure how one resolves this issue. I don't believe in the clash of civilizations. I think Huntington is nonsense. There's a couple of errors about Lebanon in the book as well, but that's not the point. I simply, I still feel, very strongly about what the Imam Ali, who of course was a Shiite divine, said, which is if you see another man, he is either your brother in religion or your brother in humanity. If only we would say that of the Muslims and they would say that of us, we might be able to talk seriously to our equals. I'm always struck by the way in which we think deep down that Arabs are a bit stupid. Ryan Crocker, 3.5 months ago, American ambassador to Baghdad, I know him. He said, I appeal to Muhtar al-Sadr to disband his militia in the interest of peace. Now, Muhtar al-Sadr is not stupid. He knows that the Americans will leave, and when they do, he needs a militia. So he's trimmed it a bit and said some nice things about standing down for the time being, but he's not going to disarm. He's not stupid. He watches Arabiya, he reads the newspapers, he sees Al Jazeera. The last thing he's going to do is obey for peace from the US ambassador taking away all his military force, and then no doubt he'll be arrested, like the poor old guys back in 1920, you see. We constantly don't accept this as being a real people out there who have the same intelligence as we have. One of the things I must say, which I don't understand at all, in the Arab world there is only one university which has a Department of American Studies and History, and that's the University of Balamand in northern Lebanon. It's run by Christians. Only one. Your country, coast to coast, has forests of universities with treasuries behind them, with departments of Middle East Studies, Islamic Affairs, Muslim Affairs, Middle East History. And when I listen to your State Department people in Beirut or Cairo, they haven't the slightest idea what they're talking about. Don't they? Is there nothing between? Is there no coalescence between this enormous pit of knowledge, real knowledge, and you people are taught beautiful Arabic, and the State Department? We had Karen Wright, who was someone will correct me if I'm wrong, who was Bush's lady, who's Karen Hughes, excuse me, whose job was to come around the Middle East and explain to us that there was nothing wrong with US policy. It was the presentation that just wasn't getting across. And I actually went along, there were, not her, but there were 2 other US diplomats turned up in Beirut with this message, and I couldn't resist. It was a bit like listening to Palin on Thursday. I couldn't resist going along. And sure enough, less than half an hour, a Lebanese journalist stood up in fury and said, "It's the policies, you fools!" Of course, that is the problem. How do we deal with this when, even when I talk to U.S. officers, not up in the brigadiers and the generals, they're way out of my area, but when you talk to the colonels and the majors in Iraq or here, Special Forces major I met the other day in New York, I meet Marines sometimes in San Diego, they have a very good idea what's going wrong in the Middle East and what's really happened in Iraq.